Hey everybody, Kronos here with another DCS video, and today what I want to do is talk a little bit about what modules, planes, helicopters and the like I would like to see in DCS and why. Now, I got that idea when a few weeks ago on the Huggit Reddit there were things going on started by one of the third-party devs asking about the interest of a FMA Bukhara module, which by the way would be a plane that would have made my list, because I like lesser known planes like this. Anyway, inspired by this, more and more users posted their suggestions of what would be a good module for DCS, with some interesting suggestions, though as time went on they got progressively less likely. As much as I would find a full fidelity DCS module of the Xenia Fleet System TIE Interceptor interesting, I fear the chances of that happening might not be very high. Anyway, that gave me the idea to make a video talking about what my favorites for modules in DCS would be and why. That is something that comes up in the comments every now and then anyway, and it does give me the opportunity to talk about aircraft a little bit, which just happens to be something I generally enjoy doing. So I figured I'd make a quick video and give a bit of an overview what I would like to see for a DCS module. Now, before we start, let me go over quickly about a few things I do or do not take into account here. First of all, as you probably know, DCS modules are extremely complex, and in order to do such a module at the appropriate level of detail, a vast amount of knowledge and information about the aircraft is necessary in order to do it properly, and this is very often a limiting factor when it comes to what kind of modules you can realistically expect to show up in DCS. For example, the K-50 and A-10 modules both used information gained by earlier military contracts, and pretty much all of the modules from third-party programmers either have some connections to the industry to gain access to insider information, or even have pilots of the particular planes on the developer team. However, in this video I want to pick whatever planes I would like to see in the game, regardless of how likely they are to actually happen or not. So I am aware that some, if not most of the aircraft I will talk about in this video are very unlikely to actually show up, for that reason alone, that it might be very difficult to get the necessary information on them to portray them properly in DCS. Also, I will try to avoid planes that are already announced or hinted at that they may be in development, or were already in development but for some reason the development has been stopped or put on hold. The Mi-24 Hind would be an example for that. Of course I would love to see a Mi-24 Hind module in DCS, who would not? The helicopter was already in development by Belsentank though, as far as I can gather, but has been put on hold pending the introduction of multi-crew, because it was determined that the helicopter would need a two-man crew to be effectively used in DCS, and that is an understandable decision in my opinion. Older attack helicopters were designed to attack in high-speed attacks, even diving attacks initially, so you can't get around the two-man issue with an auto-hover like you can to a certain extent on the Gazelle, for example. But with multi-crew being hopefully fully introduced soon, that might change in the future. Anyway, I will try to limit myself to planes that, as far as I can gather, were not announced to be already in development by ED or one of the third-party developers. So, if you wonder for example why there is no AV-8 Harrier on this list, that is because it is already announced, so no reason to go over it again. Though with DCS being out for a few years already, I could of course be missing something. Also, that I don't mention a certain plane does not mean I'm not interested in it. I'm interested in pretty much all of planes and helicopters you can think of, and you would be hard-pressed to really find one I would not care about at all, but of course I have to limit the number I talk about in this video. So those are just the ones that, if I had the ability to just snip my finger and magically make a DCS module appear out of thin air, I would start with. Now, as I have said in the past, I personally am very interested in second and third generation fighters, also early fourth generation like the upcoming F-14 Tomcat for example. That I think is a somewhat unusual time frame for a main interest, as most players are either interested mostly in World War II or World War I era planes, or modern ones like the F-16 and flankers and the like, and while I like all of those too, I personally am most interested in the time between those. I just think that this time frame from a simulation point of view has the best of both worlds. Radars, missiles and other avionics do exist and play an important role, but are not as dominating as on later planes. So those are planes like the MiG-21 we already have in game and I really love, or the upcoming F-5E Tiger. And they also just recently announced Dassault Mirage 3, which I was really happy to hear about. Planes like this also simply do not show up as often in simulators than World War II planes or modern ones, which makes me want models about them even more, because there are just not that many alternatives. Also, I find this old pre-digital technology very fascinating. Now, since one big thing for me about simulators like DCS is to learn about the aircraft and learn things I have not known previously, I am also very interested in less famous planes. So that are some of the influences on my choices here. Well then, let's take a look. Now, my first pick, I guess, is also the most usual and expected one on the list. That is the MiG-23 Flogger, the standard Eastern Bloc fighter before the MiG-29 and Su-27. The MiG-23 is considered a late third generation fighter and was introduced in 1970, so right up my alley, and the MiG-23 is certainly one of the planes that not just me but many others would like to see in DCS and have asked about. However, so far I could not find any evidence that one is actually in development for DCS. There are a number of reasons why I would like to see a MiG-23 in DCS. Since I really like the MiG-21, I would really like to see what could be considered its big brother in DCS, with technology that is similar but a little more advanced and capable, and have a chance to play around with some of those earlier BVR missiles you get on the MiG-23. Now, the MiG-23 would also fit in well with many of the other upcoming modules. MiG-23s and F-14 Tomcats, for example, clashed multiple times in reality, especially during the Iran-Iraq War, as did Mirage and MiG-23s too. And of course, with my interest in planes of this area, I would love to see more options here and eventually have enough planes for a full multiplayer server focused on this time frame. But while we have quite a few fighters of this era announced by now, like the F-5, the Mirage and the Saab Viggen, and to a certain extent also the F-14, though that is already considered a first generation fighter. But all but the MiG-21 we already have in the game are Western aircraft, so it would be nice to get more Eastern designs as well, to keep a certain balance up and also to compare the differences as well as similarities in fighter design the two sides, East and West, have gone for during the Cold War and that era. Having another plane with variable geometry wings also would be interesting to again have a comparison in how this was solved in the MiG-23 in comparison to the F-14 for example. As to what version of the MiG-23, I am pretty flexible. I would prefer an air-to-air version, as for strike fighters and ground attackers I would have other preferences. I personally would pick the MiG-23 MLD, that would fit the competition as well as the MiG-21 BIS the best timing-wise in my opinion. Though admittedly the huge 30mm Gatling gun you find in some ground attack variants of the MiG-23 is interesting too and would be a nice counterpart to the A-10's weapon, so I would not say no to a ground attack MiG-23 or MiG-27 either, but I would prefer a fighter version. So this is it for the first DCL module that I would like to see if it were up to me. Let's move on, and the next picks are probably a little bit less well known. Now, one interesting and today not so well known aspect of military aviation during the Cold War are interceptors. Now, the United States Air Force, for example, during most of the Cold War was split into three commands. The Tactical Air Command, TAC, responsible for the traditional missions of air superiority and close air support, for example, or tactical airstrikes. The second one being the Strategic Air Command, or SAC, responsible for, as the name suggests, strategic bombers, nuclear bombers, like the B-52 Stratofortress, and their primary mission being a nuclear strike in a nuclear World War III, as well as nuclear missiles and the like. And the third being the Air Defense Command, or Aerospace Defense Command, ADC, whose role is the defense of the country against enemy bombers, for example. The Soviet Air Force also had a similar layout with differences between the Tactical Air Force and the Air Defense part. Now, today the planes of the Tactical Air Command are the most well known and famous, obviously because they saw most of the action, planes like the F-4 Phantoms for example. Interestingly though, during the early stages of the Cold War, the Tactical Air Command was considered outdated and the least important of the three, as analysts and experts assumed that traditional warfare would not happen anymore and therefore there would not be a need for traditional tactical fighters. The next war they sought would be a nuclear one, and the most important planes would therefore be nuclear bombers as well as interceptors to stop those very bombers. As a result, those two got a lot more resources at first, which in part explains some of the somewhat poor showing in air-to-air combat in the early stages of the Vietnam War of the Air Force. As it turns out though, the analysts and experts were about as correct as they usually are, and the Tactical Air Command was what was needed the most in the decades of the Cold War. As a result, as mentioned, the planes used by the TAC are pretty well known and famous today, while the interceptors of the ADC and their Soviet counterparts are a whole lot less well known. But as I have also mentioned already, I am very interested in learning more about less well-known planes, especially if they, as is the case here, did have an important part in history to play, even though they in the end turned out to be less important as was initially thought. So, for that reason I would really love to see a 60s era interceptor plane, and I will pick two favorites of mine, one from the US and one from the Soviet Union. Now, for the Air Force, what I would like to see is a Convair F-102 Delta Dagger. The plane was introduced in 1956 and one of the early supersonic interceptors, and that is why I would find this plane interesting. Technology-wise, this is an early second generation fighter, and I would find it interesting to play around with this early technology. The fighter itself did saw combat in Vietnam, and there it was stationed initially to counter possible North Vietnamese bombers, and later also used in an escort and ground attack role. In the latter, the plane could use its internal FFAR rocket pods, which were initially meant for air-to-air combat too, to be used against bomber bulks, an idea that originally came from the German R4M rockets used in World War II by, for example, the M262 fighters versus B-17 formations. That concept was apparently successful enough that it was included into a few early Cold War interceptor designs, including the F-102. Now, on the Soviet side, what I would like to see for an interceptor is a Su-15, now the name Flagger. This is a bit newer than the F-102, introduced in 1965. And this plane was a very important part of the Soviet air defense at the time, and the most capable interceptor of the Soviet air defense forces till the introduction of the MiG-23 Flogger. And speaking of, some of you might wonder when I would like to see an interceptor like that, why would I pick the Su-15 over the MiG-23? Well, simply because I find the Su-15 more interesting. It is less well known, it's more difficult to get information about, yet it is as important as the MiG-23, just one generation earlier in history. Well, other than that, I just love how the fighter looks, and I again want to know more about the technology of an interceptor of this era, radar, missiles and so on, and how it would be handled. I know that such an interceptor would have a limited role in DCS, but I would find that interesting nonetheless to fly one of them. So those are interceptor aircraft. Well, what else do we have? Now, the next one might also be a little bit unexpected. I would really love to see a DCS module about the Su-17 fighter. The fighter bomber with the variable geometry wings like a F-14 or a MiG-23. So how come out of all the possible planes I picked that one for a DCS module I would love to see? Well, similar reasons as with the previous ones. It is a third generation jet fighter to a fighter bomber in this case. Also, this plane and its variants have played a large role in history, having been used in large amounts of conflicts all over the world. Yet it is relatively unknown, which makes it interesting for me, more so than better known planes. Also, since we're getting a Saab ASG-37 Vegan, a fighter bomber version of this plane, it would be nice to have an Eastern counterpart to it as well, and the Su-17 could be it. And would therefore increase the fleet of planes from this time frame, which I would like very much. I also just like the utilitarian look of it, and I always was a fan of fast fighter bombers like this, and would like to have a dedicated supersonic fighter bomber like this in-game. The Su-25 is nice, but a bit slow, and also not a fuel module unfortunately, though I would like to see one of those as well. Now, other options for a fighter bomber I would like to see would be, for example, a F-105 Thunder Chief, or, also very interesting, a F-104G, like the German Marine and Luftwaffe used, in the version they used also as a fighter bomber more than as a fighter. But in any case, I would love to see a second or third generation supersonic fighter bomber, and the Su-17 would be my first pick at the moment. So that brings us to the last type of aircraft I would really like to see a module of in DCS, and that is very simple, a jet or a turboprop bomber. Again, Some might wonder about this since I so far never featured a bomber in my videos before, and indeed I care more about fighters. But that does not mean that I have no interest in bombers at all. Just that in the games that I had on the channel so far, bombers were often not portrayed in a way I found very interesting. But I'm still interested in the type of plane and how it is used, the technology works and how to operate it. As with fighters, I would prefer one from the 50s to 70s. Something like a B-52 though might be a bit large. My first pick therefore would be a Tu-16 Badger, an early jet bomber. But in this case I want to focus on what would be my second pick for a bomber module in DCS, and that would be the Tu-22M Backfire. And that I mentioned because recently a mod was announced about the Tu-22M. That is something I certainly will keep an eye on in the future. A supersonic bomber like this is something we never had in DCS and would be something completely new, and would provide a lot of insight in the operation and capabilities of such a plane, which I would be very interested in. It would also be fun to be on the other side for a change, using ECM, terrain masking and so on to try to evade fighters while trying to get to the target, especially in a multiplayer environment and maybe with multi-crew. So this is my last pick for the modules I would want to see first in DCS if I could just make them appear. But again, I take everything I can get and I am looking forward to all kinds of aircraft. The upcoming Super Tucano turboprop light deck aircraft, for example, I also find very interesting because it is something we did not have before in DCS. If you wonder why I have no helicopters on this list, that was not really planned, but the ones I find most interesting are either already in the game, like the K-50 or UH-1, or announced to be in development, like the Bo-105, or have already been discussed, like the Mi-24 Hind. That does not mean that there aren't still a lot of helicopters I would love to see. The OH-6 for example would be nice, but the Gazelle and Bo-105 already cover something similar, so it is not that far up in priority for me. And attack helicopters like the Cobra, Apache and so on need in most cases, like the Mi-24 Hind, working multi-crew to be really interesting. Well, that is my little what I would love to see as a DCS module list, and this is it for this video. As always, I hope it was interesting, thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you next time.